The Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability and Transportation and Maritime Security will now come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any time. And let me start by thanking everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Watson-Coleman and Ranking Member Jimenez of the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee for coming together with Ranking Member Mayer and me to hold this very important hearing. We're here today to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's use of its authority to mitigate threats posed by drones. This authority to counter unmanned aircraft, known as CUAS authority, was granted by Congress to the Department of Homeland Security in 2018. Since then, drone use has only increased in popularity, and the skies above us have never been more crowded. While many of these drones are operated by hobbyists, photographers, and journalists who pose no threat to the American people, the technology has also been used by malicious actors who seek to compromise Homeland Security in a number of ways. Most frequently, these threats have taken the form of surveillance undermining law enforcement missions and the smuggling of narcotics and other illicit materials. There is also the potential for drones to carry an explosive payload to target either persons or facilities. Even drone operators who pose no malicious threat may inadvertently threaten or cause dangerous interference around airports, natural disaster sites, and sporting events. There's no denying that with the increasing availability and use of these unmanned aircraft systems, we must be able to respond quickly and effectively to any immediate security threat. However, with all missions the department undertakes, the response to these threats must be constitutionally protected, establishing and protecting for privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. For example, civil liberty groups have raised concerns that freedom of the press may be at risk since DHS can limit journalists from flying drones above protests or natural disaster sites, areas that there is a strong public interest in providing information to our constituents. Additionally, the groups point out that conflicts with the right of due process, for example, if a drone hobbyist inadvertently crosses the invisible line, that is restricted space, their private property will be seized without the approval of a judge. Privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties protections are the cornerstone of our democracy. As DHS grapples with the very real threat posed by drones, we must be constantly on guard to make sure that civil rights, our democracy, is protected. It's a fine line for the department to walk, and engagement from DHS offices of privacy and civil rights and civil liberties to oversee the use of this authority is important in this process. And today, we look forward to hearing more about how the department has worked with these offices and walks the line between mitigating threats and protecting the rights every American citizen has. With the government's CUS authority set to expire in October, we have a tremendous opportunity, a great opportunity here to examine how DHS has used its authority and thus far what changes can be made when the committee considers reauthorization. I look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses today who represent some of the department components that are most actively engaged in CUS or drone activity. With that, I thank all of you for joining us today. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of this committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mayer, for his opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, Chairwoman Watson-Coleman, and Ranking Member Jimenez for holding this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for joining us to talk about unmanned aircraft systems. Unmanned aircraft systems, commonly known as drones, are becoming a ubiquitous part of our lives. Just like any other technology, they can be used for both good and bad ends. And just within the Department of Homeland Security, but along with other government agencies, we use UAS to support firefighting and search and rescue operations, to support disaster relief, and also to help secure our borders. But as the commercial market for UAS continues to expand, there is an increased threat posed by these drones. Commercial drones, as we have seen, can threaten our airports, our critical infrastructure, and high-profile events, whether intentionally or accidentally. To address this growing threat, Congress passed the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018 to give DHS the authority to protect certain assets where there is a national security risk posed by drones. However, the authorities in this legislation do not cover such areas as large domestic airports. The bill also required DHS to assess current federal, state, and local authorities to counter this threat. I have to point out that DHS's report, which the committee received just a few months ago, is 2.5 years late. For an authority that was intensely negotiated among the interagency, as well as various congressional committees of jurisdiction, such delinquency is unacceptable. Nevertheless, the report found that state and local law enforcement entities are extremely limited in what they can do to counter the threats posed by UAS because of laws put in place to protect, importantly, citizens' privacy. Specifically, federal laws such as the Wiretap Act of 1968 and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, while still relevant and important in the fight to protect civil liberties, were passed long before drones were commonplace or even on the periphery of our imaginations. These laws effectively limit who can respond to UAS incident and how. Specifically, current statute makes it illegal for state and local law enforcement to intercept communications or access a computer without authorization. While these are necessary steps to take to counter a threatening drone, the existing restrictions on local law enforcement make it nearly impossible to track down the operator of such a drone. Furthermore, many of our critical infrastructure sites are privately owned, and their owners are responsible for the protection of these facilities. The U.S. has 16 critical infrastructure sectors whose assets and networks are so vital that any damage or destruction to them could have a debilitating effect on our national and economic security. Despite the importance of these facilities, their owners also lack legal authorities to buy and operate counter-drone technologies to protect against threatening UAS. Today, we need to examine carefully the restrictions caused by previous legislation, in addition to the lack of clearly defined authorities, which has resulted in a quagmire of laws that federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies are at risk of violating if they attempt to interfere with a threatening drone. This problem is substantial when we consider that terrorists and criminals promote the use of drone technology for illicit means. These groups can buy commercial drones to carry and drop explosive payloads, smuggle drugs, and conduct surveillance. I know that just last week, Chief Border Patrol Agent Brian Hastings used technology to counter-surveil drug smugglers. The smugglers were using a drone to scout areas for law enforcement before sending their bundles of drugs across the border. So effective means of opposition ISR. Thanks to Border Patrol's ability to use counter-UAS technology, they were able to seize over 600 pounds of marijuana. I'm curious to hear how frequent this type of occurrence is and whether they have increased over the past 5 years with the proliferation of off-the-shelf drones. Congress has put forward some legislation to address this threat. For example, to prevent terrorists from using drones for nefarious purposes, I co-sponsored Representative McCall, the ranking member on Foreign Affairs, his Stop Iranian Drones Act to prevent Iran and Iranian-aligned terrorist organizations and militia groups from buying commercial drones and parts to use in attacks against U.S. and allied nations. This type of legislation is a step in the right direction, but there is far more to do. But I'm looking forward to hearing today from all of you, specifically from DHS, on two things. First, I want to know what DHS is doing to work with other federal agencies and state and local law enforcement partners to mitigate drones and how effective this coordination has been. And second, to hear what DHS needs based on the demonstrated experience with UAS, particularly on our southern border, to mitigate this threat more effectively. Given that the authorities granted in this act expire in October, we need now to decide how and to what extent we should move forward with these authorities. To that end, I think DHS needs to make its case on whether Congress should renew these authorities, should modify them, extend them, because as of right now, I don't think we have made that case yet, but I'm hopeful that DHS can provide clarity and can help us improve the handling of new authorities granted by Congress for evolving threats to Homeland Security. Thank you again to the chairs, the ranking member, and the witnesses. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Maritime Security, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today for this critical and timely discussion. In 2018, Congress granted DHS and DOJ a limited authority to mitigate drones posing critical threats to specific facilities, or in other words, to engage in what we call CUAS. This authority expires in the fall, and it falls to Congress to determine whether to reauthorize, eliminate, or reform it. As October approaches, it is imperative that we open up this important conversation to the public and the privacy and civil liberties stakeholders in particular through forums such as this hearing. For years, DHS, together with DOJ and FAA, has briefed this committee on the threats that malicious and unauthorized drones pose to the homeland. Though we can't discuss everything we've learned in this setting, we know the threats are real. Drones are cheap to produce and purchase, and operators, whether malicious or unwitting, can cause major problems when they fly drones into restricted airspaces. Drones wreaked havoc upon Gatwick Airport in London for a few days in 2018, causing thousands of flight cancellations. And in my home state of New Jersey, air traffic at the Newark Liberty International Airport was shut down for an hour and a half when drones breached its protected airspace in 2019. We've seen drones interrupt sporting events and cause disruption. And one could imagine drones facilitating more serious harm to our nation's security, whether through hostile surveillance of sensitive government facilities or critical infrastructure, or even use in kinetic attacks. As drones become more ubiquitous and more advanced, these risks are only going to grow. According to the FAA, there are currently 850,000 registered drones in the United States, including 300,000 commercial drones and 500,000 recreational drones. To be clear, drones provide many benefits to society. Journalists are using drones to cover the news. Hobbyists are using drones to enjoy their weekends. Businesses and governments are using them to inspect infrastructure, survey land, and monitor crops. As with all new technologies, we can't focus just on the risks or the benefits. We need to balance both. In this spirit, I do have some questions about Section 124N, the government's CUAS authority, as it is currently constructed. When we create limited exceptions to laws like the wiretap, as this authority does, we must consider fundamental principles like privacy and due process. When we place limits on the use of a technology like drones that journalists use every day to cover protests, natural disasters, and other matters of core public interest, as this authority does, we must consider the First Amendment of the Constitution and the freedom of the press. That means that we need a clear understanding of how DHS is interpreting key terms in the statute and ensuring statutes' First and Fourth Amendment protections are upheld. And we must ask ourselves as we look forward, what more can we do to ensure privacy and civil liberty unions protections are baked in at every level of DHS's CUAS planning and operations? And while I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses about the real threats posed by drones, as well as DHS's response to these threats, I am equally eager to learn about the department's approach on questions of privacy and civil liberties. Homeland security may be about protecting our nation's critical assets, but there is no asset more critical than our values. I look forward to engaging in this public conversation as we work to determine an appropriate path forward on these issues. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us, as well as for their efforts to ensure our nation is prepared for the long list of drone-related threats that we may face. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for an opening statement. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Correa, Chairwoman Watson-Coleman, and Ranking Member Meyer for holding this hearing today. The number of unmanned aircraft systems, commonly known as drones, in our nation's airspace is increasing, and their technical capabilities are continually improving. The evolving threat of drones used by unknown or malign actors present a challenge in keeping our country's transportation systems, critical infrastructure, and borders secure. In 2018, reports of drone sightings near the runways at London's Gatwick Airport caused the cancellation of 1,000 flights over the Christmas holidays, negatively impacting about 140,000 passengers and resulting in a significant economic impact. In the United States this year, there have already been 2 commercial flights whose pilots were forced to take evasive action to avoid collision with a drone. DHS is currently testing technology to detect and track and identify drones entering restricted airspace. Last year, I was pleased to visit the TSA testbed at my home airport of Miami International. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on how security and surveillance technology can be used at airports and surface transportation sites nationwide to protect the traveling public. The number and sophistication of drones at the southwest border has also increased over the last several years. I'm particularly concerned that transnational criminal organizations are using drones to move migrants and narcotics across the border and conduct surveillance on Customs and Border Protection personnel. It appears that the use of drones for illicit border activity is widespread and it's a critical element of these groups' operations. I thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss what capabilities DHS is using to counter drones through the authorities Congress gave them in the Preventing Emergency Threats Act of 2018. Thank you, Chairman and Madam Chairwoman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded that committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. Without objection, members on the subcommittee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists. Our first witness is Ms. Samantha Vinograd, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security. She began her career as a Deputy U.S. Treasury Attaché to Iraq, subsequently served on the National Security Council. She was previously a CNN National Security Analyst, a Senior Advisor at the Biden Institute, and a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago Institute for Politics. Our second witness, Rear Admiral Scott Cleninden. He served as a U.S. Coast Guard Assistant Commandant for Response Policy. He is responsible for U.S. Coast Guard policy in 7 operational mission areas, including defense operations and law enforcement. Before that, he served afloat for 14 years at sea on Coast Guard cutters, conducting multi-mission patrols in the Atlantic, Pacific, and throughout the Caribbean. Our third witness is Austin Gould, the Acting Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Operation Support at the Transportation Security Administration. He is responsible for strengthening TSA's operational capabilities and driving mission performance through analysis and innovation. Prior to joining TSA, Mr. Gould served as a captain in the U.S. Coast Guard. During his 30-year Coast Guard career, he worked in a variety of operational and acquisition management positions. Our final witness, Mr. Dennis Michelini, Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner of Air and Marine Operations at Customs and Border Protection. He began his federal law enforcement career in 1995 as U.S. Border Patrol agent. In 2000, he became an aircraft pilot and joined AMO. From 2013 to 2016, he served as Director of Air Operations, where he was responsible for UAS operations and the employment of new UAS technologies throughout the CBP environment. Deep breath. Without objection, the witness' full statements will be inserted into the record. And now I'm going to ask each witness to summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Samantha Vinograd. Welcome, ma'am.
Chairman Correa, Chairwoman Watson-Coleman, Ranking Member Jimenez, Ranking Member Maher, and distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for inviting the Department of Homeland Security to be with you today. I began my government service under the Bush administration in 2007 as a civil servant at Treasury, both in Iraq and Washington, D.C. I subsequently served on the National Security Council in a variety of roles, and I was honored to rejoin government service last February at the Department of Homeland Security as senior counselor and later as acting assistant secretary for counterterrorism threat prevention and law enforcement. It has been an honor to serve bipartisan administrations on critical national security and homeland security issues affecting our country. Let me be very clear at the outset. The Department of Homeland Security considers our CUAS mission to be twofold. We are focused on using our authority to mitigate credible threats to the safety and security of DHS missions. At the same time, in doing so, we are just as focused as protecting privacy and civil rights and civil liberties, and I look forward to sharing with you how we are accomplishing both aspects of our CUAS mission. DHS is judiciously implementing the authorities that Congress granted in the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018 to conduct CUAS operations. These operations respond to the evolving and dynamic UAS threat environment and ensure that privacy and civil rights and civil liberties are protected. The department exercises this authority to protect national security and public safety while minimizing the impact to the national airspace system. Technological advances have accelerated UAS capabilities across commercial and recreational applications. Their compact size and often low cost make them suitable for performing a variety of beneficial mission sets. UAS play a transformative role in fields such as transport and delivery, emergency response, critical infrastructure management, agriculture, and more. DHS supports the lawful use of UAS. We are only concerned with malicious or illicit use by threat actors. We do know that the scale and scope of UAS threats are increasing. We are deeply concerned about UAS weaponization, smuggling, surveillance, disruption, and the fostering of other illicit activities, particularly at airports and in border regions. My colleagues today will provide additional details on what we are seeing from a threat perspective and how DHS is responding. We also know that as we look toward the future, emerging technologies will expand the boundaries of what is possible for threat actors. We are positioning ourselves to remain ahead of the technology curve through dedicated research, testing, training, and evaluation efforts. The Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018 grants DHS and the Department of Justice relief from several federal criminal statutes when performing CUAS actions identified in the Act, which allows us to engage in very specific electronic detection and electronic mitigation through intercepting the communications between a control device, a command device, and the UAV itself. This authority explicitly enables the protection of designated covered facilities or assets from credible UAS threats that relate to specific DHS mission sets. The Act also authorizes DHS and DOJ to protect NSSE and SEER events, a provision of support to state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement upon the request of the chief executive officer of the respective state or territory for mass gatherings that are limited to a specific time frame and location, as well as the protection of an active federal law enforcement investigation. DHS successfully coordinated over 250 operational CUAS deployments and 30 research, testing, training, and evaluation events since the authorities were granted, consistent with the requirements outlined in the Act. In those deployments, DHS has never caused undue interference with the national airspace. And, importantly, our privacy office has seen no cause to implement a privacy compliance review or to engage in another form of a privacy investigation since the authority was granted. To ensure consistent application of CUAS authorities across the department, DHS established a CUAS Program Management Office This office manages and supports CUAS activities to ensure component alignment. DHS is a large organization with departmental strategy and policy guidance. This is especially important, for example, for our coordination with the FAA. The PMO has worked closely with the FAA to develop objective standards that define critical elements of coordination at the department. Moreover, the Secretary issued DHS-wide policy guidance, which requires components to establish their own internal CUAS policies. The policy guidance establishes formal processes for components to obtain deployment authorizations.
Ms. Vinograd, I'm going to ask you to summarize and conclude your statements.
Certainly. DHS applies a multi-layered approach to promoting privacy and civil rights and civil liberties, which I will articulate today, both at the department-wide level and the component level. We also are focused on ensuring transparency and promoting First Amendment protected activities when we do work with the FAA to implement a temporary flight restriction. I'm very honored to be with you here today and look forward to answering your questions with respect to gaps in our authorities and the way forward with respect to the threat landscape. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I recognize Rear Admiral Clarendon to summarize his statement in 5 minutes as well. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, sir. Chairwoman Coleman, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Jimenez, Ranking Member Mayer, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Coast Guard's capabilities to counter the emerging threats posed by the malicious use of unmanned aircraft systems in the United States. As the principal federal agency responsible for the safety and security of U.S. ports, inland waterways, and along more than 95,000 miles of coastline, the Coast Guard works collaboratively with relevant stakeholders to combat threats in the nation and maritime critical infrastructure and key resources. The novel threats posed by UASs are increasingly concerning as the proliferation of small UAS continues to increase in the maritime domain. Over the last 4 years, the Coast Guard observed significant increases in UAS activity in the maritime domain, as well as an acceleration in the rate of suspicious UAS sightings over or near maritime assets or facilities, such as ferries and cruise ship terminals and refineries. Over the same period, UAS interfered with or crashed into Coast Guard assets, ferries, cruise ships, and other commercial vessels over 80 times. These numbers, which are concerning, only represent the events that were formally reported, verified, and analyzed. UAS usage in the maritime domain requires additional risk consideration as a part of the operational planning cycle. This is important because there are no flight restrictions or commercial maritime critical infrastructure and key resources, and the owners and operators of those facilities have consistently expressed their concern about the threats posed to their facilities by UAS. The Coast Guard views the ability for maritime critical infrastructure and key resources, facilities, owners, and operators to obtain flight restrictions as an important step in securing the airspace over the maritime environment, and is working with Federal Aviation Administration to address these concerns. In addition, the Coast Guard coordinates all counter-UAS activities with the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department's Counter-UAS program, and other relevant law enforcement stakeholders to ensure appropriate frequency and spectrum management protocols are followed to mitigate national airspace system impacts. Since the enactment of the Preventing Emergencies Threats Act, the Coast Guard has conducted 26 separate counter-UAS events requiring Federal Aviation Administration coordination, including 5 special event assessment rating and 2 national special security events. Before deploying its counter-UAS capabilities for these types of events, the Coast Guard conducts a thorough review to ensure the appropriate protection of civil liberties and privacy rights for those individuals who could be impacted by counter-UAS operations. The Coast Guard also closely collaborates with the Federal Aviation Administration for the generation and release of public notices advising UAS operators and the public of the location and time period when the Coast Guard will be conducting those operations. We take our responsibility to protect the maritime critical infrastructure and key resources and events with the Maritime Nexus seriously, and we look forward to the renewal of the Counter-Uas authorities granted by the Preventing Emerging Acts threat, which enabled Counter-Uas operations in support of the nation. Thank you for your enduring support to the Coast Guard and your interest in this growing mission area, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Gould to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Correa, Chairwoman Watson-Coleman, Ranking Member Meyer, Ranking Member Jimenez, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss TSA's Counter-Unmanned Aircraft Systems, or CUAS, activities. From its creation in the aftermath of 9/11, TSA has dedicated itself to strengthening the security of our nation's transportation systems while ensuring the freedom of movement of people and commerce. Unmanned aircraft systems represent a recent challenge to this security. As you may recall, in December 2018, London's Gatwick Airport was shut down for 33 hours following drone sightings over the airport. This was a wake-up call for the aviation sector. The result of the shutdown was the cancellation or delay of over 1,000 flights, disrupted travel plans for around 140,000 passengers, and economic losses estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. The United States has also seen instances where aviation operations were disrupted by drones. In January of 2019, 1 month after the Gatwick incident, Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey was closed for over an hour after a drone sighting. And in March of 2021, the Greensboro High Point Airport in North Carolina closed for 2.5 hours due to drone sightings. TSA has seen a steady increase in UAS events reported near transportation systems. For calendar year 2021, nearly 2,000 UAS events were reported to TSA. This was a 110% increase over the previous year. Of those events, about 1,500 occurred near airports, including 686 near major or Core 30 airports. While most of these events did not impact air operations, I want to highlight that since the beginning of 2021, 49 of these events required an aircraft to take evasive action, and 5 of these were commercial flights. In October of 2018, Congress passed the Preventing Emerging Threats Act, providing DHS and DOJ the authority to use counter-UAS systems to protect certain covered facilities and assets as determined by the Secretary and the Attorney General. While TSA has not provided specific authority in the Act, the law provides limited authority for DHS to carry out activities related to the protection of an active federal law enforcement investigation, emergency response, or security function that is limited to a specific time frame and location. To that end, response to a persistent drone at an airport constitutes such an emergency response. After the Gatwick event, federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, Federal Aviation Administration, and the Department of Homeland Security, drafted a concept of operations outlining how the federal government would carry out actions to mitigate a similar event at one of the Core 30 U.S. airports. This CONOPS designated TSA as the lead federal agency for such a response. Any use of TSA's authority for response to a threat would include Secretary approval and close coordination with the Federal Aviation Administration. Since the passage of the Act and signature of the CONOPS, TSA is prepared to protect airports from threats posed by UAS. TSA maintains a team of federal air marshals to execute DHS-authorized UAS response at covered facilities or assets. TSA also uses this team to conduct UAS-specific Joint Vulnerability Assessments, or JVAs. Since February of 2021, TSA has conducted these JVAs at 17 of the Core 30 airports and will complete the remaining by the end of 2022. TSA also requires the Federal Security Director, or FSD, at every airport to develop a tactical response plan which outlines roles and responsibilities during a UAS event. Federal Security Directors conduct annual tabletop exercises of these plans with local stakeholders, including airport authorities, local law enforcement, the Federal Aviation Administration, and other federal agencies. Lastly, to support the development of CUAS capability in airports, TSA has established a technology test bed at the Miami International Airport, where TSA, in coordination with DHS S&T and the Federal Aviation Administration, evaluates detect, track, and identify technology, including radar, thermal imaging, and electro-optical cameras. These tests do not currently involve counter or mitigating capability and are intended to assess the performance of tracking technology in an airport and ensure that technology complies with DHS outlined privacy measures. The results will help us understand which technologies are effective in actual airport environments. Thanks to your support, TSA has the funding it needs to establish a second test bed at Los Angeles International Airport, one of the top airports for reported sightings. This funding will help us determine what equipment is best suited to identify threats. I appreciate the committee's interest in this important issue. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I recognize Mr. Michelini to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairs Correa, Watson Coleman, and Ranking Members Jimenez and Mayer. It's an honor to be here today on behalf of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection to discuss CBP's Counter-Uas operations. I started my career in border security more than 27 years ago, first with the U.S. Border Patrol, and then transitioning to air and marine operations. Nearly 10 years of my law enforcement career have been dedicated to UAS activities, and I've witnessed firsthand the evolution of the UAS threat at our borders. There are 3 areas I'd like to highlight: the current threat of UASs at and near the border, how the critical authorities granted by the Preventing Emerging Threats Acts enables us to respond, and the importance of improving domain awareness to identify, deconflict, and mitigate credible threats. Transnational criminal organizations use drones to conduct unauthorized surveillance of law enforcement personnel and their activities. This results in organized criminals on the ground becoming acutely aware of law enforcement's location. With that information, criminals and smugglers are then able to evade detection by law enforcement and facilitate the unlawful movement of people and illegal drugs into the country. Additionally, drones transport goods, and although they have limited payload capacities, the potential risk is significant. For example, a hobby drone can manage about 4.5 pounds of payload. If that 4.5 pounds was strictly fentanyl with a 10% purity, that single drone would be transporting 80,000 legal doses into the United States. And that's one drone. The overall volume of UAS traffic, both for legitimate recreational and commercial purposes and criminal intent, has rapidly expanded in the past few years. Over a recent 5-month period, CBP sensors captured more than 30,000 drone flights within close proximity of the southwest border. Nearly 15% of those occurred at night, which is in violation of FAA daytime operational regulations, and nearly half exceeded the FAA regulated altitude of 400 feet, some reaching altitudes of 4,000 feet. However, among these more than 30,000 flights, there were only about 4,300 unique drone IDs, indicated repeat violations by the same UAS operators. This illicit use of UAS threatens the safety of CBP's frontline personnel, poses a risk to our aircraft, and adversely affects our border security operations. However, thanks to Congress's passage of the Preventing Emerging Threat Act, CBP has been enabled to take targeted and deliberate counter-UAS actions. Consistent with the Act and DHS policy, CBP implemented a counter-UAS policy and subsequent operation plans in July of 2020 to ensure efficient and appropriate application of this authority. As authorized by DHS Secretary, CBP operates counter-UAS devices at select, active locations on the southwest border and targets specific threats to covered facilities or assets while ensuring the protection of civil rights and civil liberties. Authorization for counter-UAS operations is a methodical and thoughtful process. It requires a credible threat determination based on extensive analysis and evidence. Since CBP's implementation of the counter-UAS operations, there have been a number of credible UAS threats mitigated. As operations expand, we will continue to apply our counter-UAS authority with the same prudent and targeted application to effectively identify nefarious operators and devices amongst the expansive amount of legitimate drone traffic. As technology evolves, counter-UAS authorities will become even more critical. We have seen evidence of TCOs pursuing the use of larger drones with more maneuverability, more payload capacity, and greater capability to fly longer, higher, and further. This means that we will require a continued commitment to achieving persistent domain awareness. Having the ability to fully understand the environment in which a threat is operating is critical to protecting lives and countering criminal organizations. With your continued support, CBP will further efforts to counter this rapidly evolving threat and expand our risk-based, data-driven implementation of counter-UAS operations. I thank you for the opportunity to appear today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir, for your statement. I want to thank all the witnesses today. I'll remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. I will start out by Mr. Michelini, if I may. I was disturbed by your statement because it shows the emerging threat of these drones in many ways. That's the defense side. What about the offensive side? Are you looking at are we using drones at northern and southern border to make sure that we're observing those things that are going on at our borders?
Absolutely. Small UAS and drones, both rather large up at altitude or small UASs deployed by both USBP and OFO, are used extensively. But in the context of counter-UAS, it's that environment where you can understand who is the players on each side. That gets very, very complicated without the sophistication of a domain awareness technology out there. But to go back to your opening statement, absolutely. Both law enforcement and, of course, the cartels are using small UAS for their benefit.
So if I may ask, clearly, when we develop policy, we coordinate with federal, local, state agencies to make sure that we're all on the same page. Do we do that also dealing with the Canadian authorities or the Mexican authorities and other nations that we may have to coordinate when it comes to drone activity?
We absolutely do. Within the United States, we coordinate, of course, with the FAA, state and local, for any kind of work we're doing along the southwest border. There's a lot of coordination that has to get done between manned and unmanned, these small UASs, in the environment of the southwest border on the U.S. side. When dealing with, for instance, Mexico, there are resource restraints on either side, and so while we can be mitigating threats from small UASs crossing the border back and forth, and through further investigations, both us and the Mexican law enforcement can work together. But what I would have to say is on a case-by-case basis with just what's
When you
available.
say you can work together, what do you need to actually work together better consistently?
At the ground level, the relationships are fantastic. Again, with resources available, there is a lot of moving parts in the southwest border. On the northern side, for the detection that we employ, that is done by just us on the U.S. side. I'm not aware of any mitigation capabilities or domain awareness for small UAS on the southern side.
Mr. Michelini, my questions are really directed at trying to anticipate this area that is already a very, very threatening, emerging challenge, and love to, as policymakers, get ahead of it so that as we move forward, we're there instead of thinking what we should have, could have. Let's get ahead of this threat. Second of all, let me move in my last 2 minutes to Ms. Vinograd. To what extent has the Department of Homeland Security included the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and Privacy Office in developing your guidelines and policies?
Chairman, thank you for such an important question. As I mentioned, the department's CUAS mission is to mitigate credible threats to the safety and security of DHS missions, and to do so in a way that is consistent with privacy and civil rights and civil liberties. DHS conducts every single CUAS operation consistent with the privacy provisions and civil rights and civil liberty provisions in the Act, as well as the First and Fourth Amendment and other relevant federal statutes. The department does have DHS wide policy guidance that has a specific annex on privacy and civil rights and civil liberties, developed in close coordination with our Chief Privacy Officer and Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Officer. Further, every component that engages in CUAS operations has component-specific privacy and civil rights and civil liberties guidance, and every authorized individual within the department that engages in CUAS operations is required to receive training specifically on the Act and the existing privacy and civil rights and civil liberties provisions. Finally, sir, the department has published a public privacy impact assessment, and every component program, in coordination with our privacy officer, every component program must be accompanied by a privacy threshold assessment, and where needed, a specific privacy impact assessment.
Thank you very much for your comments. Seeing that I'm out of time, I'll now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Mayor, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get a little bit more into the authorities. Mr. Michelini, since CBP started using the authorities in the Act in late 2021, we mentioned several of the UAS incidents that have been mitigated, and the drug seizures that have resulted, and the arrests that have followed from those. How is CBP looking at continued use of the authorities, and what is the alternative if there's an expiration of these authorities in October?
Well, the authorities are essential for both domain awareness, seeing the threat environment, and mitigating the non-participating actors that you want to. It would be very hard to go forward in an environment where the authorities are not established.
And
I'm sorry, sir.
Please.
It is a title change. What's happening with small UAS strategically on the interplay between what's going on the southwest border. I think you're going to hear it from many of the members here today and the panelists. The change is we've had 5 near misses with small UAS in the last year and a half in an environment in helicopter use like I used to fly, where there's not supposed to be a lot of players around. That's pretty staggering. And we've had, just in the last year and a half, thousands of crossers of small UAS. It is a subject that has to get addressed, and I believe the department is doing an excellent job of moving forward in a thorough and methodical fashion to get this done.
And Rear Admiral Clarendon, kind of similar question on your side. Obviously CBP, there's a little bit more flexibility when we're talking about an international border and some of the restrictions and implicit authorities there. But within kind of Coast Guard's broader domain or just Homeland Security in general, what is your view on what restrictions would be put in place, or what opportunities that we currently have to protect the homeland, to protect against counter-UAS if these authorities were to expire in October?
Ranking Member, in short, we would not be able to conduct these operations without the provisions of the Preventing Emergency Threat Act. Right now, the provisions are sufficient for our operations as we run them, but we also share the concern of the proliferation of the use of UAS around secure facilities and assets, and so we would look forward to the continuation of the PETA Act, sir.
Thank you. Shifting a little bit to Mr. Gould, can you explain TSA's role in protecting against UAS around commercial airports? I know you mentioned kind of those top 30 airports, but does TSA need additional authority to be able to successfully protect a broader array of airports? I represent Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're not a top 30 airport. We're top 100. What is the expansion of that counter-UAS capability look like? And as I mentioned, is there additional authorities needed to protect a broader array of civil aviation assets?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that question. The authority that we have right now allows us to, as you said, conduct counter-UAS operations in Core 30 airports, subject to the approval of the Secretary. That omits airports like you mentioned, your home airport. Right now, we're involved with doing joint vulnerability assessments at these larger airports, which identify drone launching sites, potential areas for surveillance where a drone operator could cause an issue at an airport. We also do our tactical response plans and our exercises annually, and we're radically advancing our knowledge of UAS activity around airports through our test bed in Miami. However, our ability to respond is purely reactive at this point, And I believe that authorities would allow us to be more proactive, particularly in terms of detect, track, and identify, to assess when there is a threat, where it's coming from, and respond accordingly would be essential moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. No, and I think obviously we're looking at both the accidental and the intentional use of UAS to cause harm. Mr. Michelin, as you mentioned, you wouldn't expect border airspace at lower altitudes to be congested, but when you have rotary wing assets that are going through and potentially running into these, it's only a matter of time before we lose the lives of some of our brave folks who are guarding down there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I'll recognize Chairman Watson Coleman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for sharing your information. I want to start with a question to Secretary Vinogradov. How frequently or regularly does DHS interact with and collaborate with the civil rights and civil liberties entities that have expressed concern about this bill and this authority?
Chairwoman, thank you. The Department of Homeland Security is working through the office, our Chief Privacy Officer and the Office of Privacy, as well as our Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, does engage with members of the communities that you have mentioned. Further, as we look forward and as we acknowledge the escalating threat environment, as well as the need to judiciously apply any authorities that DHS currently has or may be granted going forward, DHS is committed to continuing engagement with members of the communities that you described to ensure that we understand any concerns.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. I want to get a handle on understanding how regularly you interact, get feedback from, and give information to these organizations and entities, because they have serious concerns. I get it that drones can be really a real threat. Those that are intentionally malicious and those that are innocent. But what I want to know is to what degree are we respecting those concerns of those agencies or entities? So how regularly does your department, whatever office it is, interact with them? If at all.
Chairwoman, thank you. I can tell you today that we regularly interact with members of those communities, and I'm happy to follow up with you after this hearing with more specific information and details on those interactions. I will say that the CUAS program at DHS is not a surveillance program. It is used to mitigate credible threats. The CUAS program is also deeply focused on transparency.
I'm there with you. I am there with you. And I really appreciate your willingness to get to me after the fact. I specifically would like to know what DHS's policy is and actually what is done as it relates to consistent, dependable interaction and collaboration with these groups. So through the chairman of this subcommittee meeting, I'd like to ask that information be sent to us. Again, I'd like to ask you, what data precisely is captured during a UAS mitigation? And do you believe DHS could, under the current statute, capture additional data, or are there existing statutory protections against capturing more data than is strictly necessary to mitigate the UAS?
Chairwoman, thank you. Under the provisions of the Act, DHS currently only collects data on the signal between the control device and the UAV. That includes, for example, telemetry and location information. Currently, the Department of Homeland Security does not collect and is not able to access, for example, call logs or text messages or the contents, let's say, of what the control device actually is. Further, consistent with the Act, DHS only retains that data for under 180 days. And again, it is not the intent of any CUAS operations to collect any personal information that may be related to the control device or the UAV, and DHS has judiciously respected these provisions in the Act and will continue to do so going forward.
Listen, I did have another question, but I really don't have enough time. So let me share this. I am someone that believes that drones are a potential threat, that they're a real threat, and that we do need to have protection of our safety and security. I also believe very, very intently that our values are mightily important to protect as well, and that is our privacy, our due process, and things of that nature. So I am very much interested at some point in just hearing what you think is missing, what you think you all need more of, how you respond to some of the areas that we think there needs to be clarity in understanding exactly what you can engage in and how you can engage and how you can collect and when you issue warrants, et cetera. With that, Mr. Chairman, I am going to yield, but there are so many more questions that we do have with regard to the implementation, the appropriate implementation of a legislation of this nature. I yield back.
Ms. Watson-Coleman, I couldn't agree with you more. So many more questions. Thank you very much for those. I'd like to recognize now the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa. I also couldn't agree more with Chairwoman Watson-Coleman about not only is it a threat, the coming threat, we have a threat now, but I think it's actually going to get worse. And so I have a series of questions. First, I want to relay something that happened to me like around 2017. I had the privilege of going to Israel as the mayor of Miami-Dade to look at technology. And I can tell you that the Israelis were extremely concerned about drones, especially around the airport, Ben Gurion Airport. And that's why really at MIA we have a pilot program right now because of that concern that came out of that trip to Israel. There are two concerns that I have. I have the current technology is piloted unmanned air systems, but I'm actually more concerned about future technology, or maybe current technology, which is unpiloted unmanned aircraft systems. Basically, a system where you can actually tell it what to do and it goes off. Right now, we have a lot of our capability in intercepting and interfering with communications with piloted, unmanned aerial systems. I don't believe we have any capability about unpiloted because they're not being piloted by anybody. They're basically intelligent. Going back though to the border, Mr. Michelini, I'm sorry. You see thousands of unmanned aerial systems flying around all the time at the southern border. You see them, you detect them, you know what they're doing and all that. What can you do about them?
Sorry, the commanded and non-commanded. Those are complicated subjects that I think there are some options out there, but I think we should maybe talk about that in a closed hearing for that.
Fair enough.
But for the piloted one, it's not just what you see, it's the preponderance of what you don't see. And a story I can remember hearing like a year and a half ago is one of the first times we turned on these devices, they saw 40 or 45, and by the way, these are not, the ranges of what they see are not very far. They saw 40 targets that nobody was aware of. Both counter drone it was counter for the on the Mexican side, and also small UAS crossing the border. So the amount out there is really staggering. This authorization though is the foundation to how we're going to address our domain awareness gaps on the southwest border, and it is essential to keep this running.
Well, do you have the authority to take them down if you consider it to be a threat?
We do mitigate. We do mitigate small UAS. It's a methodical process. We set up an area that we have a high risk, and we walk through a process that's built, trickled down from the DHS policy straight to CBP. So we do have that authority.
And now, Mr. Gold, I still have a major concern of we can see them, we can interrupt them, interrupt their capabilities once they get into there's a zone, right? There's a barrier, there's like a fence, right? And those piloted unmanned aerial systems we could do something about, or many of them. It's the unpiloted aerial systems that really concern me, and the capabilities that they may have in the future, especially carrying destructive payloads, okay, into an airport. Do you have the authority now to take these down if they cross over into restricted airspace?
Sir, DHS has the authority to mitigate counter-UAS in accordance with an emergency response or a security incident, like I discussed in my opening statement. As a lead federal agency, TSA is the lead federal agency under that authority. In terms of having the capability to actually do that today, we do not. We're focused on detect, track, and identify. I'd like to highlight your concern. I met with the Center for the Protection of National Infrastructure, which is the UK's version of infrastructure protection, prior to this hearing to discuss the Gatwick incident. They believe that, at least on some of those flights, when Gatwick was shut down, it was a drone operating exactly as you said. No connection to a ground control station, purely by GPS waypoints. Difficult to detect, difficult to interdict.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that we need to probe further into this about what we're doing about, are we funding sufficient research in order to obtain offensive capability? A defensive capability which is offensive in nature, we're basically taking them down. Because I really do believe that it's a matter of when, not if, a major event is going to be happening either at the border or it's going to be happening in one of our airports or one of our transportation hubs through the use of these unmanned systems. Thank you.
Mr. Jimenez, I couldn't agree with you more, and what I'd like to do is follow up with a closed discussion with Mr. Michelini on some of these issues at the border and these drones. So I'd like to have the staff try to schedule that. Thank you very much, and now I'd like to recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gould, several unmanned aircraft systems incursions have been reported at airports, and the one you mentioned in Newark Liberty International in January of 2019, where planes were halted and diverted for over an hour, as you stated. Would you briefly discuss the ability of drones to disrupt airport operations and what impact this has on travelers and airport employees? Are there measures Congress can take to support Transportation Security Administration to address this threat?
Thank you very much for the question, sir. With respect to the incident at Newark Liberty International Airport, the drone actually wasn't that close to Newark. It was flying at 35,000 feet over Teterboro Airport, which is a municipal airport sort of adjacent to Newark. But it was in the flight path for Newark International Airport. 3,500 feet is far above the altitude that a drone operator is allowed to fly. They're limited to 400 feet. It was high enough to interfere with the flight path. That interference at an airport has an exceptional effect. Flights need to be diverted, they need to be rerouted. Airports sometimes are large enough where you can just use a different runway. However, the drones are mobile. If it was someone who was determined to really cause a disruption to the airspace, they could just relocate the drone to the new airspace that's being used. So it is a significant problem with a cascading effect of airport delays, inconvenience to travelers, disruption of airport workers, disruption of security is a very, very significant event. Sir, I'm not sure if you had more than that you asked. I couldn't quite hear the end of your question.
I asked, what could Congress do to help you along the way in addressing, to support the TSA in addressing the threat?
Sir, thank you very much for that. I think, like the other witnesses, I think renewal of this authorization is essential. And from TSA's perspective, not only to Mr. Meyer's question earlier about would we go beyond the core 30 airports, which increased authorities would allow us to do, It would also allow us to protect other modes of transportation, because this is not unique to the airport environment. Pipelines, refineries, railroads are all subject to unmanned aerial systems incursions that right now we do not have any authority to respond to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, in light of the size of the committee today, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. I recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa. Mr. Michelini, as I'm listening, and I understand there's this authority needs to be renewed. I don't know the details and the confines of the authority, but what I think I heard you say, or it comes out of the testimony in the memos I've looked at, is there are a lot of drones flying back and forth across the U.S.-Mexico border. Is that correct? I don't think your microphone came on, but
That is correct.
Okay. And you gave a couple figures. I don't know whether they include both things that are drones just on the U.S. side and those going back and forth, but you mentioned 4,300 unique IDs. In other words, 4,300 different drones up in the air and 30,000 flights in the last 6 months. Is that what you said?
That were recorded, correct.
That you recorded. And these, and you know, Sonny, we get new terms and everything. We got UAS, and then we got CUAS, Counter-Uas, so I'd say anti-drone mechanisms that you've got available. Sounds like they're surveillance things, so you can pick out more of them. Is that right? You can find them. You can see them.
Just with the, so with the Counter-Uas technology we have, I want you to think of it as both, you know, to detect and mitigate. Typical radar that's used in the manned aviation environment, they're not really picking this up. So when we started it down this process of Counter-Uas, it was both the technologies to detect and then the technologies with the authorities to mitigate.
So mitigate, if I read the memo, or there's maybe a summary of the memo correctly, it sounds like you can maybe jam a transmitter and force the thing to land or something. Is that sort of the right idea?
Right, there's communication between, not to go down that other line, but there is communication between the operator and the small UAS or drone. When the communication is just interrupted, usually what happens is whether you own a small UAS or not, it'll have a return to home or some sort of land function to it.
Okay, so I get it, but to me, and I get mitigation sounds pretty timid, and so does that when I hear it described. I mean, Mr. Jimenez asked the question, do you have the authority to take them down? Maybe I can't understand. Maybe you could just help me understand, are there legitimate reasons for cross-border drone flights? Because we don't allow anybody, I mean, well, we're not supposed to allow anybody to come in the United States. Unfortunately, in the current state of affairs, we allow tons of people to come in the United States illegally. I don't understand a reason that we would allow drones to come into the United States. Why don't we shoot them down?
Well, in a kinetic response like that, CBP is mitigating by bringing them out of the sky. They are returning to the ground, but we have not done kinetic responses like that.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking as a policy matter, if you're able to speak to it. Maybe not, I'll get him as Vinograd, or if that's the right pronunciation of your name. Forgive me, I didn't catch that earlier. But what is the policy reason? I just thinking about it from the perspective of Americans watching this hearing, they may say, why would we allow? Staff had a notation in the memo that one drone has had 1,500 flights across the border. I don't understand why we permit that.
Well, it's not for not trying, sir. This is a brand new technology that we're forwarding to the southwest border. What we look for is specific areas that there's a high risk, multiple crossers, and then we set up with what technology we have, and we begin a CONOP, an operation in that location. But like I said, there is a lot going on right now that this act is helping us finally target and address.
I hear you. I'm concerned about whether the act goes far enough, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask about. So I get that you said that drones are used by Mexican cartels both to detect your movements and locations so that they can facilitate smuggling with it. And I think you said they're flying in drugs. And we know what a small quantity of fentanyl will do. So they can fly drugs in the United States.
Yeah, in small amounts. But again, just the idea of being overhead to help move a group that might be backpackers with drugs, which could be even more, is a fantastic strategic tool by the cartels. So both are very nefarious and very dangerous.
Yeah. How do I pronounce your name?
My last name is Vinograd.
Vinograd, beg your pardon.
Sorry.
Vinograd, you're the policy person here. Yes. Why are we content to let Mexican cartels operate drones across the United States border. Why don't we take them down? Why isn't that a threat to the United States national security? We wouldn't allow airplanes to fly in, would we?
We would not. And let me assure you, sir, that the department does not believe that it is appropriate or acceptable for cartels or transnational criminal organizations more generally to bring illicit substances across the border. Currently, the Secretary has designated parts of the southwest border as a covered facility or asset, which gives my CBP colleagues the authority to detect, identify, track, and mitigate CUAS that pose a credible threat to DHS mission sets. At this juncture, CBP, and I'll defer to my CBP colleague, feels confident that they have the appropriate authorities as well as operational plan to mitigate these threats. We are consistently reviewing the threat environment, both as it pertains to what parts of the border are designated as covered facilities or assets, and whether additional mitigation technologies are needed. And in a closed hearing, sir, we would be glad to go into further details on what those mitigation techniques look like.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on your comments, which is I'd love to, in a close hearing, talk to Ms. Vinograd and Mr. Michelini about how many of those are actually real threats, and how many of those are just people, knuckleheads, who don't understand that this toy is actually causing possible dangers to themselves and other people and other assets. You go down to the local store, you buy one of these drones, you decide to fly it up, and I'm wondering if this is an educational issue, if people don't understand this is not a toy in the context of its use. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a closed session later on. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Titus from Nevada for 5 minutes of question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going back to Mr. Bishop's point about why don't we shoot them down. I don't think it's quite that simple. I don't think you start firing off rockets to shoot down drones in neighborhoods or along the border or along the river where people live and all. Could maybe Mr. Gould just address that, some of the problems that would exist if we just start firing off rockets to shoot down these drones?
Well, thank you for the question, ma'am. Right now, from a TSA perspective, we are focused solely on detect, track, and identify in the airport environment. Airports have a lot of ambient energy. Detection systems that might work in a very open area will be adversely affected by that ambient energy. And our ability to mitigate a drone event at an airport really is predicated on our ability to find it and ensure that it has some sort of nefarious intent or inadvertent encroachment on an airspace. With respect to mitigation, like I said, from a TSA perspective, we're not quite there yet. We do consider the communications link disruption that will bring the drone down to a safe landing either by the operator or in a predetermined location. In terms of actual kinetic responses, like have been discussed, we're not really contemplating that yet.
Well, just to continue that conversation, I know that in Las Vegas, a lot of people are using drones within that 5-mile perimeter around McCarran Airport to try to take pictures of the Las Vegas Strip, which is right in the heart of my district. They know they're not supposed to be there. And I don't know if you consider taking pictures of the Strip nefarious or not, but certainly they cause harm. Often they make a plane have to be diverted or can't take off or something like that. Could you talk a little bit more about what we could do as members of Congress to help you deal with those kinds of threats?
Well, right now, thank you very much to the Congress for funding our test bed in Miami and soon to be Los Angeles so we can do detect, track, and identify activities.
I lost you. Reed? I lost you.
Ma'am, are you there?
Reed?
Hello?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I can't, they've just turned off.
We're here. Can you hear us?
Can you hear us now? I can't hear them.
Ms. Titus, can you hear us? Hello?
I didn't touch anything.
A drone attack. Can you answer the question if you
Would you like me to
can?
finish the
Yes,
response?
please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm well aware of the drone situation in Las Vegas as well. The Las Vegas Strip is a very attractive location for people to film. There was a commercial aviation aircraft on final approach to Las Vegas. It was actually tailed by a drone photographing it not too long ago. So back to our detect, track, and identify mission that we're testing out in Miami. I cannot emphasize the importance of that work enough. It allows us to quantify the problem in the airport environment and to expand it to other airports. In Miami specifically, we had about 105 reports of UAS in the last year. From a visual reporting perspective, using technology down there, the number exceeds 20,000. Now, these are not all near the airport. It's in the greater Miami area, but many of them are clustered around the airport. And pursuing our detect, track, and identify capability will help us address that problem. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, maybe we can work on some of that to be helpful to address this problem with TSA.
Ms. Titus, you have a minute left.
That's all right. I'll yield back. That was mainly what I was concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Now I'd like to recognize a gentlelady from Ms. Harshberger, gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Harshberger. Ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a gentlelady. Thank you to the witnesses today, and I do have some concerns, and I'd like to direct this question to Mr. Michelini. You know, you mentioned that these drones go from 400 foot to 4,000, and you know, it's the same offenders time after time, and there's going to be larger drones used to increase the payload that they're carrying. You know, I've read reports that the drug cartels are using these drones to facilitate the movement of drugs and illegal drugs over the southwest border. I guess my question is, I know Mr. Jimenez was talking about taking these drones out, but from what I understand, you can render the software useless and you can cut those off. I'm looking at a recent report about a U.S. provider of vector graphics editing software who closed access to the services for those drones. Is that a possibility? And do you know the make and model and what type? You've listed that there's been 4,300 drones identified because you do have to register those. But, you know, my question is, what capabilities does CBP have to counter these transnational criminal and drug trafficking organizations on the border? Can we do that with that software?
We absolutely can. I mean, for the hardware and software that we utilize across the southwest border, we use other metrics necessarily than just their ID number. It's a little complicated in that we're working very close with the FAA, and that's how we deconflict what may be a rancher or somebody flying their small UAS and a nefarious character using a small UAS. It's not quite as easy as to do with a manned aircraft where it's on a radar target and you can see it. First, you have to set up these counter-UAS devices and detect it. One of the problems, though, is you can buy a small UAS right now and it might have a ceiling. It might have a built-in ceiling of 400 feet. And if you take it out and try to fly it, the software knows where it is. But when you hear these examples about them flying higher, either that was pre-software or people have gone around the software kind of limits on their platforms. So while you can, you know, this is just how crime works, is while you can set software limits in a piece of machinery, once you buy it, though, things can be altered.
Yeah. Well, that's crazy. You know, 4,000 foot, that is, that's VFR for a small aircraft, you know, a personal aircraft, personal pilots. So, you know, that's a little bit crazy. Do you know the models or which drones, I guess, you're confiscating more of? That's why I'm asking.
We
or
do
the make
know
and model of those drones, because some, you know, DJI is a Chinese drone. I'm just questioning what you're seeing.
Well, they command about 80% of the market, so predominantly we would see that company. I don't have on me right now the specifics of the companies that we've that we're tracking or the few that we have interdicted, but that's information I could get to you.
Yeah, that would be great, and like you say, they can alter that software later on. And it's terrible, but we see the increase of drugs and increase in the payload that they, drop across the border we already have problems. So that's just it's not going to mitigate it all. It's just going to increase the problem with the drug flow. So with that, Chairman, I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me now the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and ranking members of the respective Transportation and Oversight Committee. This is a continuous important issue and an issue that we should certainly focus on. Again, to witnesses, let me express my appreciation. Let me just simply say, this is really about saving lives. I guess I immediately think of, in addition to the other elements of this problem, is loss of life in a flying commercial airline. Let me ask Rear Admiral Cleninden, if I would, and Mr. Gould, what is it most of all that DHS or the department would like to do in the future to be more protective or to really to cease or to bring down the potential damage with the use of drones by individuals and possibly terrorists?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And so right now we have the authorities and the capabilities we need to complete our pilot program. Once we complete our pilot program, we'll move to what we call a program of record, a more permanent, both in the types of systems we acquire and the numbers that we need to support our maritime security operations. And as we do that, we'll communicate with the department and with the administration and with Congress for any additional needs. But as we stand right now, we have what we need to complete the pilot as long as we can continue the PETA authorization.
Mr. Gould?
Ma'am, thank you for the question as well. Right now, our authorities are, DHS's authorities are limited to the core 30 airports. They're very reactive and they're for a limited time, limited duration, and for a very discrete event. In the future, I believe that additional authorities for other airport environments as well as other modes of transportation are essential. As I said before, pipelines, rail systems, major terminals, cruise ships, they're all subject to the same sort of nefarious drone activities we see at an airport. And being able to go beyond the core 30 airports to those other modes of transportation, I think, is very important. Thank you.
Mr. Gould, I'm going to continue with you because I thank you for that openness. I don't think many members, except for your testimony, realize that you have a limitation when we have over 300 million people and the land mass that we have here in the United States. Why don't you probe that a little bit more as to how dangerous it is to leave these other elements out of oversight and the authorization that you would need?
Chairwoman, if I may just jump in for one moment, thank you for articulating some of the gaps in existing DHS authorities. The administration will be in the very near future submitting a legislative proposal to Congress that articulates the gaps that we seek to address in the reauthorization process. I will note that in the statutory assessment that was provided to Congress in December, the administration did review and articulate gaps that we do see, which include the proactive and persistent protection of airports by DHS. DHS currently does not have the authority to engage in that proactive and persistent activity. Further, we have articulated that airports do not have the authority to, for example, purchase equipment to unto themselves engage in detection and mitigation of unmanned aircraft system threats. So we look forward to submitting that legislative proposal to you and to addressing these gaps based on the escalating threat environment.
I thank you, and I think I'd pose the question to Mr. Gould as to the extent of the potential danger. TSA. Mr. Gould?
Ma'am, I agree with my colleague from the department on where we're at in this. Drones present a threat in the airport environment and the transportation environment writ large. It's a very challenging threat. It's a very dynamic threat. The proliferation of drones are growing significantly. Detecting them, identifying friend from foe, legitimate operations from perhaps malicious operators is a true challenge in transportation venues, and it's one that we need to address with a whole of government solution. I'm very pleased with our interagency oh, go ahead, ma'am, sorry.
No, I just said thank you very much. Let me just get in the last question of how much are we fearful of a terrorist utilization of these drones? Someone can quickly answer.
We are deeply concerned by the potential use of malicious threat actors, including terrorist organizations, related to the use of unmanned aircraft systems.
Well, I look forward to working with the committee and working with the administration for a very important issue. And I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Any other members wish to ask questions under this first round of questioning? Seeing none, I would ask the committee if anybody would like a second run of questions. That's an affirmative. Ranking member.
It's just not a question, really. I really want to push forward with this committee looking at what we are doing as a nation to, we can detect them, we know they're there, but what can we do about it, okay? And we need to work on the capabilities of doing something about it sooner rather than later. So I would hope that this committee can have a closed session on that in the near future. Thank you.
Mr. Jimenez, I would just comment that I concur with you, and before we get there, I'd like to have that closed session with some of these folks here to get a better picture of what we're facing and what actually we need to at least to begin to address the emerging threats.
Well, if I can make one more comment, we don't have to shoot missiles at them. Okay, so I mean, I want to get that off the table. Okay, there are other ways that you can mitigate and have an offensive capability, a defensive capability against these without being missiles. And I've news the Israelis are doing some stuff with this, and that's some of the things that we really need to look at.
And Mr. Jimenez, I totally agree with you because I think it starts out with education. Again, take care of the knucklehead factor, which are people just think it's cute to fly their drone into an airport area, which without understanding the implications after that, then you have the criminal element, then we go to the next level of action. Mr. Bishop, you had some questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to pursue this same avenue. I do think, to Ms. Titus' point, I certainly don't think we should be firing missiles at drones in Las Vegas. A lot of things happen in Las Vegas. I think that would be a bad modification. And I see...
But it would stay in Las Vegas, right?
It would stay in Las Vegas, I'm not sure. I think we're conflating a couple pieces of this that require different responses. So, Mr. Gould, I'm very sensitive to the difficulties of figuring out how to mitigate the problem of drones, both nefarious ones and ones that are just sort of idiots operating their drone around to take pictures around U.S. airports. I get that. I see a very different picture in terms of cross-border flights from Mexico. And so, Mr. Michelini, I'll sort of return to you. It's funny, I know it's sophisticated. You guys are engaged in very sophisticated business. I appreciate that you are, but we always kind of revert to language like we're going to mitigate the threat, which doesn't really tell me what and then it turns out you're jamming their signal, so they got to land their drone. That doesn't really seem to do it to me. And so, to Mr. Jimenez's point, I don't even know what it requires. I don't profess to be a technical expert, but I want to ask again, because you've said that there are cross-border flights to bring in drones, or at least that potential exists. You said there are cross-border flights in large numbers. I can't think of a legitimate reason for a cross-border drone flight from Mexico. Now, if one goes from the U.S. over to that side, I really can't see why that would be either, unless they're yours. So what's the reason that would be legitimate for there to be a cross-border drone flight, and there appear to be lots of them, and why would it be, in your judgment, reasonable to limit our policy to at best, the mitigation you've described, which is causing that drone to land. I can tell you that I don't think if you blew up a bunch of Mexican cartel drones, particularly the heavy ones you're talking about, I don't think they'd keep doing it.
No. Well, first of all, you're absolutely correct that there should be no cross-border flights of small UASs, right? That is illegal. Part 107 does not allow that. And same before, you can't go above 400 feet without a waiver, and there's no cross-border flights. To use that word that you brought up, mitigation, that is what we do, though. The aircraft will either flutter down to the ground where we are or return, but it is incapable then of, it's done. We have stopped that threat in that case.
Is it technically not possible to destroy them?
I can just tell you, since I've been in this program, we haven't run down that corridor yet. So it's just something that hasn't been explored.
Is the answer to that question one under behind closed doors?
I think we can. Well, we can probably pursue. I'm sure DOD, who has had authority to do this, is in a different category than us. Like, again, this is a brand new authority for us. It's only a few years old, and we have taken a very careful way to go forward with it. And that's exactly where we are right now. And we feel pretty comfortable with where we are and in absolutely growing these capabilities. We just haven't entertained that one.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize Ms. Harshberger, who would like to.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask one more? Time's still
Sure.
there.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Or it was before they clicked. Just one thing further. Yeah, I noticed that in September of last year, FAA issued a no-fly order for drones for a period of time because there were so many in the air. It was really triggered. I got the impression it was directed at news organizations because they were having this influx of Haitian migrants at the time. If you can do that, why couldn't you follow the same course and get an FAA order to have no flights across the border?
Well, the TFR, that temporary flight restriction that was set up, again, you have to appreciate that's just set up for people who are willing to participate, right? So if you're a cartel member and you set up a no-fly zone somewhere, you wouldn't necessarily follow it. So we're back to the category we were before, where we have to detect them and mitigate the threat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Now, again, Ms. Harshberger, you recognize for 5 minutes of questions, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one other question for Mr. Michelini. You stated that you keep seeing the same offenders over and over. Are these people not being prosecuted when you do find them and you know that they're accountable for these illegal drones and illegal drug smuggling or whatever they're doing? Are they not being prosecuted? And if not, why not?
They are absolutely being prosecuted. So when we do identify a drone to mitigate or follow the response, there's a couple of actions we can take. We can run down an investigation. Many times we can track the drone and know where it's landing and taking off. And then, of course, both law enforcement on both sides of the border can act out legal proceedings. So that is the case. We do respond and make arrests to illegal drone use.
So are they being allowed to be repeat offenders again then, even if they are held accountable? I guess I don't understand that part.
No, so the data point where we said there's multiple, there are some unique IDs that have flown back and forth. That just means we haven't got to them yet. Once we do make arrests, then the court proceedings would go as they do.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. And with that, I yield back, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Questions, Ms. Lee?
Yes, thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. This is fascinating, overwhelming, and creating a sense of, I think, warranted fear. This may be a line of questioning that, Mr. Chairman, I join you in the classified circumstance, but I'd like someone to say, give me the sense of what is the depth of the problem, meaning that is this a growing problem? And with the proliferation of baby drones that 5-year-olds are getting for Christmas presents, which may not go up more than a certain amount, but who knows what level is purchased. What's the depth of the problem? If I can either get that from the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism, and as well, the depth of the problem around airports. I want to focus around the commercial flying industry and the potential for a catastrophic incident because of the proliferation of drones. And whoever can take that question.
Thank you. I agree with all the adjectives that you used and more. The threat environment is escalating both in terms of scale and the scope of the threats associated with unmanned aircraft systems. Because of technological advances as well as the low cost of these UAVs, their maneuverability, the low risk to the operator, as well as the fact that many people think they're fun, these are becoming a platform and a tool of choice. And to be clear, they serve a lot of beneficial purposes. We are very aware that because of the factors that I laid out, UAV traffic is increasing significantly. What that means is that, just proportionally speaking, both unintentional hazards and malign uses of UAVs are going to create more credible threats to DHS missions. That is why we are focused on addressing any gaps in our existing authorities. And Congresswoman, you asked about airports. Thank you for asking this question. I'll turn to my colleague from TSA in a moment, but we have significant data and unfortunately actual incidents that point to increasing threats to airports. As I previously mentioned, DHS currently doesn't have the authority to engage in proactive and persistent CUAS operations at domestic hub large airports. That was indicated in the statutory assessment that we provided to you. So in summary, because the threats are going to increase, that logically means that the threats in and around these airports are also going to increase. And we, in the legislative proposal that the administration will soon provide to Congress, very much look forward to working with all of you in addressing these critical gaps.
And ma'am, thank you also from a TSA perspective for that question. I agree with my colleague from the department. The airport environment is where unmanned aircraft systems and commercial aircraft can just come into contact. You know, airplanes are trying to land or take off. People are flying drones around. It just is inherently a high-risk operation. But it doesn't even have to be that close to the airport. Like I said before, when Newark Liberty was shut down in 2019, the drone was at 3,500 feet over an adjacent airport, but it was high enough to interfere with the flight path for Newark Liberty. That creates issues with potential mid-air collisions. It creates problems when aircraft have to take evasive action, which happened 49 times in the past year, involving 5 commercial flights as well. But it doesn't even have to be a mid-air collision that really causes a problem. A drone incursion on an airport that was somehow militarized could create a problem with an aircraft just sitting on the ground, fully fueled or being fueled. And like I said earlier, the number of incidents that we see around airports is quite staggering. The visual reports that we get are just a tiny fraction of what technical data shows us is really occurring around the airport. It is a significant problem and one that we really do need to address.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I will just simply say the witnesses have been excellent and a clarion call has been made, and I look forward to working with the administration and our agencies on this. I'm laser focused, if I might, on the airports and surrounding areas. And I think Mr. Gould and Ms. Vinograd, you have given us a pictorial horror story that should not be cited as over-exaggeration, but a call to action, because that is our obligation, both Congress and the executive. And I thank you for the future offering of this legislation, which I hope to be a part of, to be able to help solve this problem and secure America's skies as well as the American people.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lean. Mr. Jimenez, you had some thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Again, some more comments. We do have some capabilities against piloted unmanned aircraft, but my fear is that the capabilities of these unmanned aircraft is getting more and more sophisticated, and really for nefarious purposes, they can be unpiloted and just given a mission, and the drone will carry out the mission. Period. And you can't knock it down because it's not communicating to anybody. It's all internal. So that's why I think we need to have something of a closed session and talk about these issues, and then also the issues, how can you actually, knock them down? Because as you said, it's not about a mid-air collision. We can have a drone go into a militarized drone go into an airport and cause havoc and destruction and loss of life. So it's a great danger, something that has been identified for some years, and it's going to happen. You know, I'm telling you, it's going to happen. Okay, and so we need to be prepared for it. We need to stop it in any way possible. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Jimenez. Any other members wish to comment or question our witnesses? Seeing none, I just wanted to thank our witnesses here today and just to remind folks that we're talking about 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet up in the air, but there's also another area that we should consider, and that is, 15 feet off the ground, backyards. More and more people at home are sitting at home Sunday afternoon in their backyards, then you have a drone come in to essentially observe what you're doing as a private citizen. And these are privacy issues, and we need to address them as well. So with that being said, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their most important question. Ms. Miller-Meeks, did you want to ask some questions? 5 minutes? Of course, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Jimenez. Mr. Michelini, I've read reports and I've seen firsthand on trips to the border that drug cartels are using drones to facilitate movement of drugs and illegal migrants over the southwest border. I know you alluded to this in your testimony. Can you describe, and if it happened during my absence, I apologize, what the CBP has seen, and then what capabilities do you have to counter transnational criminal and drug trafficking organizations on the border?
So what we have, so as far as small UAS and what we have seen, I think you might have been out, but we had 5 near misses just with our own aircraft and a small UAS in the last year and a half. We've had 6,500 illegally cross the border since August of 21 that we've seen. Again, this is really important, just to go what Mr. Gould is saying. It's just what you see, right, where you have your capabilities. And then 1,700 illegal crossings since January. The illegal crossings are just one category of it. The other category is just parking drones so the cartels would create a sense of domain awareness of where they want to go, whether that's how you cross by a port of entry or how you cross between ports of entry, and then how law enforcement on the U.S. side is reacting to how you're crossing. So it's a great tool for the cartels. And again, they don't have First or Fourth Amendment. They don't have any concerns, right? They're just operating at will. So we have developed from DHS lead a CONOP on how we execute counter-UAS operations on the southwest border. Presently, we have 2 covered locations, and we will intend to expand it all within a judicial, concise process to ensure we're doing this within our authorities. It is a process, and we are moving forward, and I think we've had some great successes, and we've had a lot to learn, and it is, like every other person sitting here, it is an uphill battle right now, but in a moment like this, I think there's some clarity on where we need to go.
So given the increased usage of unmanned aerial drones from both the CBP side, U.S. side, and from the cartels, and that we have supply chain issues, is there a supply chain problem that you're experiencing in relationship to getting the equipment that you need?
I'm sorry, I wouldn't be aware if there's a supply chain problem on that, but I can look into that for you.
Thank you. Ms. Vinegard, the authority that Congress granted to DHS to counter UAS in certain circumstances sunsets in October of 2022. Can you speak, if you already have, again, my apologies, about DHS's plan to seek an extension of that authority?
Thank you. In expiration in DHS's authority to engage in protective measures against credible threats to the safety and security of DHS missions would result in significant risk to all of our homeland security. As such, DHS, in partnership with other members of the administration, will in the very near future be providing to Congress a legislative proposal to seek reauthorization to address the elevating and escalating threat landscape.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing that document. Thank you to our witnesses, and thank you, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I yield
Thank you,
back.
Ms. Miller-Meeks. Anybody else want to jump in? Questions, thoughts? Seeing none again,